votre au quotidien. C'est ça fait.
SonarFeed! Woo! Hello and welcome to SonarFeed episode 268. Congratulations, Wygle. I'm busting the mics. I'm Dave Clark. We're going to talk to you here at the Berliner Pub just off of 3rd and Main in downtown Renton.
Ahead of the curve.
There we go. I'm going to start off just with a little plug. The Berliner is going to have a rotating special entree starting on Wednesday. They're doing this thing where they're going to work on the entree. It's going to be from Wednesday until they sell out of certain ingredients. It's some kind of steak here this week launch with some sides that involve steak and sauteed mushrooms and those kinds of things. You can follow Berliner Pub on Facebook and I believe the Gram for details on that. They're hosting SonarFeed episode 268. It's called Congratulations, Wygle, because this will be his last time producing the show for us.
Oh,
Wygle got a full-time job. He's
yay!
yeah, that's much fun.
And there was much rejoicing.
So, my understanding is you work for the Tacoma sports conglomerate now.
Yep. Yeah. The as yet unnamed sports conglomerate.
Your primary focus will be Defiance, but you're going to be doing basically whatever they tell you. Rainier's Defiance Rain.
It's
Cheney Stadium events?
No, my primary focus is going to be all of the teams. There isn't really. My time is not going to be split between which, like, it's going to be split, but it's not going to be like just Defiance, just whatever. Like, I'm going to be doing a little bit of everything. I'm also trying to get a tweet out
About the show?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'll talk about
and
other
tweeted.
stuff then. There, okay, good.
Because there we go. But anyway, so today was my first day. I'm working on the newly established creative team, the team that our friend of this show, Casey Catherwood, has been running, and it's been him and one other person, and now there are 5 of us. So it's going to be it's a big step
5 already?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. We've got a lot of things in the pipeline, and it's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be exhausting, and it's going to be good. Good exhausting.
Well, congratulations. That's
Thank you.
fantastic. And obviously, we'll be down there watching your handiwork. And are you going to be doing more of the online stuff, streaming? Is that your main?
So I'll still be producing the Defiance shows.
Okay.
At currently. But ultimately, my role is going to be my title. Yeah, bigger, exactly. My title is multimedia specialist, so I'm helping with any kind of video content, which is going to be going drastically up for YouTube, Twitter,
Gotcha.
Facebook, Instagram, all those fun things. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
So I let's go to the introductions because normally we do that, but I just wanted to say congratulations.
Thank you.
Wygle, early and big. I'm Dave Clark. You can follow me at BetterThan. That's BEDIRTHN on Twitter. And to my left, your right.
Mickey Turner. You can find me on the Twitters at Turner ESQ. And I'm happy to be back, although much colder than I was about 24 hours ago.
Yeah, 24. We're going to talk a little bit in the show about that because Mickey was down in Arizona for a couple different soccer things. He enjoyed some Sounders practices. He enjoyed some Sounders game. And he also went to Scottsdale for the USSF
I get that wrong. About
annual
60% of
general
the time.
meeting.
Yeah, and like you said, we'll get into that later. But it was fun. It didn't have the intrigue of last year when there was a presidential election. So there wasn't Eric Winalda and Kathy Carter and Kyle Martino. None of those people were there, and the media wasn't quite there to cover it.
I think there were 4 members of the media.
Yeah, that was about the size of it, and so it didn't have the interest level. There wasn't all the stuff going on behind the scenes as far as people trading votes and all that kind of fun stuff that you get with contentious elections. But for my first time, it's pretty entertaining and informative. So we'll get into that a little bit later and also talk a little bit Sounders too.
Yeah, we're going to talk Sounders. We'll go. I'm just going to read off the list of topics. That way I have some accountability. We're going to talk New Who versus Brad Smith because that's obviously much of the chatter. Mickey Turner is the only one of us that has been there live to see George Morris, so I'll ask him some questions about that. We are going to talk a lot about that AGM. There's some big news there. The Gold Cup is going bye-bye, which isn't necessarily a surprise. It's not a surprise that one of the Gold Cups is going goodbye. That was pretty obviously going to happen. That both are going away because the Gold Cup's competed twice in every 4 years. If they both go away, that was a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the expansion of the professional ranks because Mickey was the first person to confirm that there is another Division III Pro League that got authorized.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk a little bit about that and some other news from the AGM. We're going to then focus on Tacoma Defiance and the youth movement, how they performed over the Tucson swing, particularly focusing on Danny Leyva, who got more minutes than just about anybody. He had the 8th most minutes played of the 42 different players that have been used to this point by the Seattle Sounders in preseason. And then Ramon Torres. And as always, when I'm in charge, we're going to plug some shit at the end because why not, right? So let's just focus right first on the big picture stuff, U.S. soccer, and what you experienced. I got to watch some of the AGM because as I was basically my house is still I dug out over the weekend. We were dug out enough, but we just hid inside still because we overstocked on food. So why not just eat at home? One of the interesting things is there is a third D3 league that is certified now. Or wait, NPSL is not certified through USSF.
They're not certified
as
at
a
all.
pro league. They're falling under one of the amateur leagues, even though they're going to be professional. But there will be a total of 5 men's professional leagues next year. We're talking, obviously, MLS, USL Championship, and USL League One. Those are all pro leagues. NPSL Founders Cup is the emergence of a pro league from the NPSL ranks.
An unsanctioned one. Or at least unsanctioned by U.S. Soccer, actually.
And then finally, the third one, the NISA. What can you tell us about that?
Not a whole lot because they're still kind of forming what they're going to be doing. The basics are they're going to be Division III teams, so they'll be there with USL 1, which is where Toronto moved their former USL side. The Richmond Kickers moved down, and then FC Tucson
is the one that
there.
You probably most of our listeners know better.
Yeah, FC Tucson, and they've got around 9 or 10 teams, I think, at this point, and they actually might be up to 11. But anyway, the NISA is a league that basically wants to kind of do things their own way, but they still want to be under the auspices of U.S. Soccer, so they want to be sanctioned. They want to do things as far as being able to send players to foreign competitions and have access to referees.
Not the Gold Cup.
Not the Gold Cup. At least not. Well, for the next 3 years they'll have it, or I guess 2 years or 2 cycles. So anyway, they're going to be forming and starting in August. One of the more important things is they're going to be doing the fall to spring schedule.
Makes sense.
With a winter break, and they basically their kind of ethos or mission is to basically be what they think U.S. soccer should be, which is basically aligned with the rest of the world, or it's not even
with the largest leagues in Europe.
Yes, exactly. So they'll start in August, they'll end in April or May, and then they'll take December and January off to deal with the weather. And they only have about 4 or 5 teams, or not even teams. They have 4 or 5 cities outlined, like New England, Philadelphia, and a few others. And so those should be rolled out here in the next couple of weeks, I think. They should have their league rolled out. It's certainly going to be a gamble because the fall to spring thing has not been tested in U.S. for
decades.
Yeah.
Decades.
And there's obviously reasons why we don't do a fall to spring schedule, or at least MLS doesn't. As you can witness by
They're
the
going to
weather
take
we
December
have.
and January off, or January and February?
I believe it's December and January. I'll have to double check that.
Because if this would have been a great time last week to have level below Tacoma Defiance, playing in, say, Snoqualmie or Issaquah. Would have been good weather for that. That would have gone.
Yeah. So, again, whether that works or not, they're committed to at least giving it a go. So,
one of the awesome things, though, about this is, like, you talked about USL League One, where, like, FC Tucson is, and obviously we know how big USL Championship with Tacoma is. It's 36 teams, still expanding. USL League One's somewhere between 8 and 11 right now. The NISA is at 8-ish. NPSL Founders Club is at either 10 or 11, depending on... They have a team that might exist in both the NISA and NPSL thing and through MLS. You're basically saying that there's about 100 like
pro teams
in the United States, where if you go back just like 20 years, there were like 12 in the USL and like 10 in MLS, and that was it. So over this generation, essentially, we've got almost 5 times the teams of professional soccer, and outside of the superstars that were in MLS, some of these lower divisions are paying what the back end of the bench for MLS used to pay.
Yeah.
So now you're making that in, say, the USL Championship. Some of those independent teams are paying livable wages.
Yeah. And just the teams that have been announced, or the cities that have been announced, again, they haven't even announced any teams yet. Atlanta, Charlotte, New England, and Philly are the ones that have been announced. And the rest are expected to go public here in the next couple of days, actually. And they're going to have 8, it looks like. And they'll have to be across the country. For those who don't necessarily follow what's required, U.S. soccer requires teams to be spread out geographically, so you're not just having 6 teams in your in your tri-state area or whatever. So you have to have them in the Eastern, Central, and Pacific time zones. Sometimes those things are waived, especially for new leagues, to give them a chance to get up and running. So it's possible that they don't have any teams on the West Coast, or the West Coast in the Mountain, or maybe they skip the Central. So any of those things could happen, and typically you have to request that waiver, and then you have to give them a timeline for when you're going to comply with the rule. So, and typically that's like a 3-year landing period by which you have to have all that stuff done. That doesn't always work. MLS required waivers for numerous years for stadium sizes like San Jose, back when they played at Buck Shaw.
Well, that's a team-specific waiver rather than a league waiver.
Yeah, there's all sorts of waivers that you have to comply with. And so we'll see which of the ones that they need to have more time to deal with than others. I'm trying to get that stuff from U.S. Soccer. I'm not sure if they'll give it to me on the record, or at least hopefully they'll give it to me on background. Hopefully they'll give it to me on background, and so at least people can understand what they need to do, because their standards are pretty strict, because there's a good reason. They don't want leagues just doing the fly-by-night thing where they're here for a year or two, and then they're gone, and then they've stiffed a bunch of players out of their money, vendors out of the sale, and then
there are still Fort Lauderdale Strikers front office and back office personnel that have never been paid by them or the NASL, if I remember correctly.
One of that was one of the stipulations when the Cosmos got saved back in 2017. 2016, 2017, that they had to pay the back salaries of a bunch of people who hadn't been getting paid. And so, that kind of stuff happens all the time. Happens in business all over the world.
Oh, yeah.
But
I just got a nice severance when my company no longer existed. So that's
more than some soccer.
That doesn't happen in soccer.
Yeah.
That's some of the really niche stuff. With the
Did you
NIS.
just drink with your pinky out and your gloves on?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Too damn cold to be.
The bigger picture stuff is really going to be kind of influential for us. That was on the record. Carlos Cordero talked about 2 things which are massive. Let's hit the World Cup first.
Yeah.
They're talking about a 48 team World Cup in Qatar. Yeah. Now, they've already approved 2026 USA, Canada, Mexico, which will have like 16 venues.
Yeah.
Remind us all how many venues Qatar has right now.
They have a total of 8. And that
How many less than 16 is that?
it's about half as many.
Okay.
So yeah, obviously everyone had already known that U.S. Soccer or FIFA was going to go up to 48 teams for 2026. I'm not sure if that's actually been technically announced yet, but it's like it's the worst kept secret in the world. But what wasn't known is that they wanted to go up to 48 teams for 2022, and that was a surprise to me when he was talking about that. Because number one, that's a short ramp up time to get the qualifying adjusted to have all those teams. I mean, you're letting more teams in, so it's not the worst problem in the world to have.
Qualifying is going to be a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly. So number one, there's that, and then number two, obviously, is the infrastructure of Qatar. As we just talked about, they have a total of 8 stadiums that'll be ready to go by then.
Yeah, they have 4 or 5 that are totally complete right now, and at least 3 of them have their that weird like magical like carbon neutral AC thing is actually operational at cool. Full-size World Cup stadiums, and then one of the training facilities already has it too. But training facilities for 48 teams in a nation the size of Qatar is impossible.
I think is the size of Delaware. Is that the equivalent, give or take? As far as square footage or square mileage.
Yeah, and the population is basically the size of the Puget Sound.
Yeah. So, I mean, if they could fit all those stadiums in there, then that would be great. But they're not going to be able to do that.
Their original plan was to have 12 stadiums for just the standard 36 nation bid,
32,
or 32.
Yeah.
Sorry, and they pulled back from what they won the bid with because they found out that was going to be too difficult, even with all their essentially
with all
slave
the people
labor.
Dying, yes.
So they pulled back for already, and so one of the this is Dave Clark, former Arabic linguist guy that pays way too much attention to the Middle East. Qatar and its neighbors hate each other.
Yes.
Right now, and it's been a simmering thing that's lasted about 2 years. It's funny because when Qatar won the bid, it was about like unifying the Persian Gulf. Really noble concepts. Some of their concepts that they used to sell were a great idea, but they've got troubles now. The troubles are so significant that there is a Saudi Arabian plan to dig a canal across the peninsula within Saudi lands that would turn Qatar into an island. And then on the Saudi side, they would store nuclear waste. That's how well they get along. Like, this may seem trite, but that makes Trump's border wall concept look sane. And I don't say that mildly, but he's not creating an island out of the neighbor and putting nuclear waste there. So, Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, which is the most Qatari-like of the Emirates and Sultanates over there, those are the 3 nations in the area that are closest to Qatar, and they're all ones that despise it. So, however badly nations in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean want there to be 48 teams in Qatar,
the FIFA president,
you essentially have to solve world peace.
Middle East peace.
Well, Middle East peace.
Which isn't that what Jared's doing?
That's his job, supposedly. So
essentially, you've got the geopolitical situation not coming up against, we'll call it the financial considerations, greed, if you want to be a little less polite, of FIFA. And Cordero was pretty blunt about their reasoning, or who wants this. The footballing nations, as you just talked about, are the ones that are really pushing this. But it's up against the politicians, and so it's unclear who's going to win. But if the footballing contingency,
no matter how bad China football team wants it, there's no way that 4 stadia are being built in the rest of the Middle East that will be shared with Qatar.
Yeah, I don't see how it happens. I won't say it's
in
bizarre.
In 2.5 years.
Yeah, it's not.
That haven't started any planning yet.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's not something that you can't comprehend. I mean, everyone understands why they want to have that done. It's a massive influx of money. You get additional countries.
About China.
Yeah, China is definitely one of the ones that would stand to benefit from that. But there are certain practical logistical issues that just may be too much to overcome unless you have a more spread out World Cup and go to some nations where that's not going to be a problem. But the whole point, obviously, of giving it to Qatar was to foster and develop soccer in the area. So I don't know where else you're going to go. I'm going to go to Turkey.
No.
Greece, no. Some
Iran,
of the other places,
no.
no, yeah. So some of those, those
Basra?
places, yeah.
Basra in Iraq might do it. They have a good stadia.
That sounds like a terrible idea.
But
the bottom line is the greed and or financial considerations is just going to come up against the logistical issues, and so. But Cordero was pretty blunt again. He said, they absolutely want it, and they may find a way to make it happen.
The good news is the U.S. would only have to be like the 6th or 7th best nation in CONCACAF to qualify for a 48-team World Cup. And they're getting rid of the Confederations Cup, and instead of having 6 teams that are good plus New Zealand, at the Confederations Cup, they're actually just going to do the playoffs to bring it from like 54 to 48 or something along those lines, where they'll host a playoff the year prior to the World, or maybe only a few months prior to the World Cup because of how qualifying is. That's actually a cool idea to get rid of the Confederations Cup.
Which I'm a little disappointed in, just because I liked the tournament, even though it obviously was, you just have 6 teams there just, fighting it out. Or was it 8? 6 or 8?
It's 8. It's 7 Confederations winner and the host nation.
Team, yeah. I kind of like that tournament, but I understand why they're getting rid of it, especially with the new qualification system that's coming into play. So.
John Worthington says, is it going to be like a FIFA version of Fire, the Fire Festival?
A grand idea sold for money that fails miserably.
Miserably?
Yes.
So I mean that's going away. By all accounts, it's all but been announced, and that was probably the least surprising thing about the whole his whole presentation. And
in other national team news, the Gold Cup will exist this summer and 2 summers from then, and then it's probably done.
Yeah, that was super surprising because I understand, as we talked about a little bit in the opening, that having the Gold Cup every 2 years is it's unnecessary. I understand why the U.S. Soccer Federation probably wanted to do it because it's a big moneymaker for them, especially since they hosted it every year. And then you get the Mexican national team and all the fans coming to pack the Rose Bowl or down in Dallas, and then even the smaller countries, and they were packing the fans. I remember I want to say USA, El Salvador, and Baltimore. It was USA again. USA is always outnumbered in these things for one reason or another. But the El Salvadorian population dwarfed the U.S. Fan base there, so you get those games in with those countries, even though they're small. Again, for them, it's the biggest tournament they're going to be in.
Yep,
most likely, and so you just get them. You get 35 to 40,000 of their fans in, and so it's not surprising why U.S. Soccer would come in.
They'll
and,
still have a thing because the CONCACAF Nations League, which is basically like what you started seeing in Europe. Gustav Svensson competed in Nations League recently. Jordi Delem competed in Nations League for Martinique. Mm-hmm. It's essentially a way to get a version of Pro Rel into national team competition, while also determining who qualifies for World Cup qualifying.
Yeah, it worked. I think people in Europe, it seemed like, just my casual reading, I don't have any in particular insight, but it seemed like they enjoyed the competition once it got started because it cut down on the amount of meaningless friendlies, and there were some stakes to the competition because it qualified,
for them for UEFA,
Euros,
for
the Euros, which is obviously a very prestigious tournament. And so, I don't even know if the promotion relegation aspect of it was overly important, but it obviously is
It
another.
just exists.
Yeah, it's there, and so clearly it turned out to be a good idea.
And
based
that means
on
a lot more
the
games
results.
in CONCACAF. It means a lot more games for the smaller nations.
Yeah, and that's one of the stated goals.
One of the bad things, though, is for U.S. national team fans, it is going to be nearly impossible for. Well, that might not be bad. It's going to be nearly impossible for friendlies for the U.S. national team because CONCACAF will take up most of those days for Nations League.
Yeah.
The European clubs are going to be in Nations League. It was already almost impossible to do with South American nations because their World Cup qualifying is a
brutal.
round robin for 100% of the federation.
Yeah.
And so basically, you'll see essentially think of a slightly larger hex, and that's who the U.S. will face
Year round,
all the time.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, there'll probably be like one, maybe like I would say a total of maybe 3 non-CONCACAF friendlies a year, maybe, because the even with the European, Nations League,
They have one open.
yeah, they have one opening because they only have 3 teams in a pod, so someone's always got to buy. And so they fill those dates with friendlies still, and that's what U.S. was doing. They were playing when they played England, and who else did they play in last fall? Italy, I think, or France. And they played France. So those games, there'll still be 1 or 2 of those games a year, but not nearly as many as they had in the past.
But it'll basically mean 2 games a year against Mexico, Panama, Canada, maybe Canada. Canada has to qualify
yeah, they're still.
for the highest division of.
Yeah, I think they're doing all right though.
But like the Panama, Honduras, Costa Rica, Mexico, Jamaica, essentially we're going to get
A whole
them
lot of those.
every year.
Yeah, so that'll take. So with that, with that tournament or that qualification process going on, there's not really a use for the Gold Cup, especially when you don't have the Confederations Cup anymore as a carrot to. And that was specifically, that was specifically asked by one of the players or the athletes at the presentation. It's like, with Confederations Cup going, what's the carrot for Gold Cup? And the answer is there isn't one, which explains in part why it's going away.
Trophy money.
Yeah.
And that also relates. It's going to be interesting because there's going to be, for the United States national team, there's going to be less competitive soccer. But that also means you can experiment with more depth in the roster because there's no need to call it to play 100% of the awesome guys against Canada in a competitive match.
I wonder if that's good for the development of the team, though. If you're not getting, you only have limited amounts of times with those top players. You get like 5 training days ahead of your friendlies or competitions for that matter. And if you're not getting them games against, France or, even like Czech Republic or, teams like that, and you're going in against, Panama and, teams from the Caribbean, I don't even know if that's something that would you even call in your top players for that? And if you're not calling in your top players for that, you're not getting training time with them, and so then you've got a developmental issue if you're not getting top teams. But
We might still get the Copa America Grande.
Yeah.
I want to call it that.
Yeah, that was the other thing. Yeah, that was the other thing that was just, discussed because with the Gold Cup going away, there is additional time now for those types of tournaments.
It's only if Howard Schultz wins that we get the Grande Cup.
Oh, the Grande.
When it expands to the Venti.
But yeah, they were talking about that. They are still in negotiations.
20
trying
teams.
to get that done. But they have not been able to come to an agreement for one reason or another. Actually, the reason is money, I'm sure.
It'd basically be the unified Americas like the we had for Copa America Sanitario, which played here.
Yeah. Oh, it was a great tournament.
Great tournament, and for U.S. national team fans, that's the best. You want that tournament to involve the United States again because facing off against Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay,
Ecuador,
Colombia, Peru. Those are all the ones that are roughly on
I could definitely see
Chile.
It. Yeah.
Basically everybody but Bolivia and Paraguay.
Paraguay's
8 of those
fine.
teams are on par
Paraguay's
with the
fine. They
United
got,
States or better.
home run, yeah.
that's what you should look forward to. Again, that's going to be 4 years out at the earliest.
I think they're going to. I think they are going to try their best to get it for 2020, but I don't know if it's going to happen. But that's. I mean, they got the 2016 ramped up very quickly because that almost fell apart because of the scandals involving traffic and other folks. So they got that one ramped up in about 8 months, so they could definitely get it done again. Especially
we got facilities. Brazil's got facilities. Argentina's got facilities. Mexico's got facilities. Canada. There's basically 4.5 nations that can host that tournament.
And they
with like 2 months notice.
Yeah, and they already did it, so they have the infrastructure and the knowledge. So they do. I think it's just a matter of trying to negotiate how much money each confederation gets.
All right, that's our USSSF AGM recap. Let's talk Sounders because that's what most people expect us to do. That and they expect us to drink. Wygle, what are you enjoying tonight?
Well, now I'm just enjoying ice.
Okay, cool.
It's old-fashioned flavored ice, though.
Mickey?
Oh, I got a Chardonnay because I'm trying to keep things classy.
From the crowd. We got a root beer, a water, a beer, double bock. Yes, and I'm also on the old fashioned today, also with the root beer.
Still kind of disappointed, and I know that I shouldn't disparage where we are, but like it's like 18 degrees. I'd love a hot toddy. Like,
well, what's the deal with this again? I always
don't
forget.
know. They don't have a kettle for some reason, which is kind of a bummer.
They can't make hot water because
But yeah. I would love to have a. I'd love to have a hot toddy.
They have made they made a choice to get rid of like Instataps, and those kinds of like easy access to hot water things.
In exchange for some like a much better kitchen for their
the
workers.
kitchen
Like,
overall
seriously,
is a lot better.
So it was a trade off, and I'm okay because their
Of course,
kitchen workers.
the trade off for that was to have the worst winter in the the history
totally
of anybody living here. So, yeah,
that's why I ran away for a week.
I mean, there
are other reasons, obviously.
There's a reason why we didn't have 2 shows for the past 2 weeks, and it isn't just the normal SonarFeed reasons, which we're lazy. Throwing shade at ourselves because of you guys. So we deserve it, right? Okay. Damn. Yeah. So, Sounder shit.
Yeah, they were down in Arizona for a couple of weeks.
You were down there.
I was down there. It was a bit of a serendipity just having them down there at the same area. They were in Tucson, obviously. I was in Scottsdale.
How's that drive?
It was fine. It was, my chauffeur Jerry was had a bit of a lead foot, so we got down there in reasonable time.
It's basically like once you get out of Mesa, it's essentially straight and flat for like an hour and a half, and then you're in Tucson.
Yeah, it only took us like an hour 45 to get down there each time, so it was nothing wrong with it whatsoever. And so we went down there for both games, the Portland game on Wednesday, and then the FC Dallas game on Saturday. We could probably start with the Portland game because that was the more interesting one, I think.
Yeah, that's the one I forgot already, though.
Yeah.
No, the Portland game was basically youth players, essentially.
It was the second team, essentially.
The second team with a couple youth in it, not what we saw. There were other games where we saw like an entire youth movement, like the D squad.
Yeah, that was the Houston game, I think.
Yeah,
right?
second half Houston game. But Portland started with essentially the B team with a sprinkling of youth in, and that's one of those where like they were going against the Timbers' first team.
Yeah,
which was surprising. Except for Diego Chara.
Yeah, he
thankfully,
was on the bench. He was on the bench
because he didn't break anybody.
Yeah.
And one of the things I came away thinking from that Portland game was if that's the squad that goes in the like opening round of the Open Cup or even the second round of the Open Cup,
it'll be fine.
Good things like we could win an Open Cup game again for like the first time in years. That made me feel pretty good.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Yeah, that would be nice. But yeah, they were really good defensively, especially.
It was probably the best. There's only been like 2 good defensive halves, unfortunately. That first half against Portland, the first half against Houston.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't do anything wrong except for the penalty. Did that come in the first or second half?
There were two of them.
The first.
Yeah, the first one that was missed, right?
No, they scored the first one.
Scored the first one, missed the second one?
Yeah. No, it came back on VAR. They had VAR replay.
Oh,
yes.
That's right.
Yeah. So I can't. It's Delama, I think, brought the guy down in the penalty box. It was kind of a borderline call, but it looked like a foul from where I was standing, which was admittedly far away.
I talked to Andrew Harvey, who I work with on Defiance Broadcast, and he writes for everyone. Sounder at Heart, Pro Soccer USA, and some other freelance gigs. And one of the things that he had put out on Twitter about that is there are certain fouls that if they initiate outside of the box and then wind up in the box are called as fouls with indirect or direct kicks from that spot where it was initiated. And then there are other fouls like pulling on the player, which if they go into the box are penalties.
It's like a continuation in basketball.
Yeah, and so if Delem had just tripped the player, and it's interesting because he tripped him and pulled on him at the same time. If it was just the foot sweep that had happened, that one would have been called back. But because he had his arm on his shoulder as well, which prevents any sort of advantage from being played, that one becomes the penalty.
Yeah.
So it was actually the right call.
Yeah.
It sucks.
But, that aside, they were very good on defense, very organized. And then they had Marlon Vargas, who was pretty much a revelation in that game. I thought he was fantastic the entire game. Was dangerous. Had probably a goal a shot he should have put on frame to end the half, which he skied over. But it was basically
that's the one where he was trying to hit it with the inside of his boot, but instead it was the outside of it.
Well, I didn't see that. Obviously, I was on the
tried
field.
To have
I saw him swing and hit it into the atmosphere.
Yeah, he got it to curl wide rather than go. If he punched a straight shot or even one that was curling left, it would have been on frame. But it sailed away.
Yeah. But
let the
again, that
flow.
aside, he was really, really good. Set up the assist, obviously, with the help of a little deflection, but it's still a great play. Was tidy, dangerous, and for being 18 and basically having your first major start against an A team for Portland was just great. And the coaching staff was thrilled with his performance. Smetcher said after the game that they only intended to give him a half, but since he was playing so well, they gave him an extra 15 minutes or so.
10, yeah.
And so it was just one of those things where, I don't think he earned a first-team contract based on, one performance in a preseason game. But you have to wonder, given that they do have open spots available on the roster, and they were specifically looking for some of the kids to be able to, show up and ball out and maybe get a contract. Maybe they hold one of those spots and see how he does for the first, 3 months at Tacoma, and then, in June or July, they decide, well, he's deserving of a first team deal.
Vargas had the second most minutes of any Tacoma Defiance player.
Yeah. No, he's great. He was really, really good
over the preseason.
And yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's being fast-tracked or they're looking at him. But, again, it was just one preseason game. And then, so we'll just have to see what happens. And then Leyva was the other one. Was really good. He wasn't, he's a defensive midfielder, obviously. But he didn't do anything wrong, really, which is obviously what you want from your defensive midfielder. And, given that he's only 15, which is absolutely nuts.
Do you remember being 15 when you could play 90 minutes one night and then 2.5 nights later play more minutes? Wait, no, I can do that at 50. I was able to do that at 20, but that was because of the Army. I didn't really have choices. Leyva, for example, he was one of only 2 players to go 60 minutes in the match all the way back against Atlanta in that 4x30. He went a full 90 against Minnesota, against Portland, Minnesota. Against Portland, he went 90, and then he went another 12. He played the 8th most minutes so far in the season, or in the preseason. When you talk about fast-tracking the guy, they're fast-tracking a 15-year-old. Yeah. And
that's a position where I think they would like some additional help. And that came into play in the Dallas game, which was not nearly as enjoyable to watch. I guess we can flip back and forth between the two games. They just looked very lethargic against Dallas. I'm sure everyone here who watched it, came to the same conclusion. Nothing particularly insightful about that. But it did ask after after the game, and it seemed to be it was just more a symptom of them having been gone for basically the last month. They were back in Seattle for like 2 days.
Yeah.
They had played 3 games in a week, even though they didn't.
Not everybody
played all those games. And Dallas was coming in. They're just starting that phase of preseason for them, so they were probably a little more up for things at that point.
And then Dallas hadn't really played anybody at that point. Up until that point, they played like a. Was it a local college twice? And then the Byron U23s. That was it up until that point for preseason. They were hanging out in Texas, playing teams that don't really matter. And so for them, they get to finally face an MLS team. They get their they were up a little for that.
Yeah, they were probably a little more up for the game. And then also, the game was at 10 o'clock local time. Which is obviously not a time when you're typically going, full out and playing soccer games.
Some of these guys don't wake up at 10 on a game day.
Yeah, it's just it's not when you want to be playing soccer, and there's a good reason for that, because you need more time to usually ramp up for a game. And they had to catch a flight heading back out of Tucson. They basically got done with the game, did a 2-minute interview for a couple of players, and then raced to get to the airport to catch their flight. So again, I would excuse some of that, although there were a few concerning things. At least I thought I saw. I would be curious to get your thoughts. That they just had difficulty getting Dallas off the ball, closing things down. Dallas had a ton of possession.
There's a bad. The first goal was basically a bad communication between Brad Smith, Kim Keehee, and Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry, if he's going to, sure. Stephen Fry, if he's going to leave his line like that, and essentially needs to stop the ball if it's inside the area. He was a little bit caught out. Smith didn't close down quickly enough. Kim didn't occupy the space, so there was a clean ball to pass through. Kim's looked kind of shaky as a left center back. Kind of want them to switch back. Really like Chad. Chad Marshall is a best 11 quality defender at both left center and right center back. Kim, from what we've learned this preseason, goes from a best 11 quality right center back to just a center back when he's on the left. Like, to me, I don't see the same thing that made him special last year when he won the Sounder at Heart Defensive Player of the Year. Outperforming Chad Marshall in many people's eyes, and that was as a right center back. He didn't do that, and when he's on the left, he doesn't get forward as often as he did when he was on the right, which is a nice wrinkle to have in the attack. Some kind of, I don't know. That's one of the things I want to ask Schmetz about tomorrow at practice is what's going on with the center back situation. You switched Kim to a side where he's a little less comfortable. And the only other times we've seen him on the left were with Torres as the right.
Yeah, when they have the 3 center back.
They started Kim and Torres together in a 2-back, in a 4-back line a couple times, and Kim was the more mobile, so they weren't great.
Yeah. I mean, that's a question to ask them, tomorrow and through the rest of the preseason. Like I said, that wasn't really so much my concern because that seems like there's an easy fix there. My concern was mainly about Roldan and Svensson not being able to get the Dallas midfielders off the ball and just ceding a lot of possession, which just obviously you give up that much possession, even if it's not necessarily all in your half. Eventually, the defense is going to break down, and it did a couple of times. Dallas had a number of shots on goal. Roldan said that he thought it was just more that he was just more frustrated with communication and just getting on the ball. So maybe that's stuff that is just kind of growing pains of losing Ozzy and not having that pure destroyer. I don't think anybody, Svensson's great, but I don't think anybody would call him a destroyer like Ozzy. And maybe the same for Roldan, but maybe he can grow into that role. But if that could be a problem going down the line, if they're not able to lock down the midfield the way they were with Ozzy, I think it's an easier fix with Kim Ki-hee and Marshall, moving them back to their more comfortable positions, and then you've got Leardom and Nuhu and Smith, which we can talk a little bit about, and then you got your back four pretty much set. But I don't know. I'm curious to see if they think they need some additional bite in the 6 and 8 roles.
The Svensson and